There is something you have not said aloud yet, not because you lacked the words, because the words would have made it final, and you were not ready until now for how final it already was. You recognize this. The event has completed, not the grieving the event. The thing that changed inside you did not ask permission. It did not announce itself at a threshold you could choose to cross or refuse. It happened the way water finds its level, not dramatically, not with any witness, not even with your full awareness, and when you turned back to look at who you had been, there was no path, only the faint memory of a self that could have gone back, and the knowledge, carried quietly in the body, that you are not that self anymore. This is what I mean when I speak of resurrection, not restoration, not repair, not the retrieval of what was lost or the healing of what was broken. Resurrection, in the psychological sense, the only sense that matters, is the permanent death of the one who was waiting to return to themselves. You cannot go back to who you were because who you were was the wound held in the shape of a person. And the wound has closed, not healed, exactly closed, transformed into structure, into something that does not bleed when pressed, but does not yield either. The still water knows this. You have seen it not literally, perhaps, but the image lives in you. Water that has stopped moving does not look like death. It looks like arrival. It looks like a surface so undisturbed that the sky above it appears twice, once above, once below, and for a moment you cannot say which reflection is the true one. That doubling is what individuation looks like from the inside. Two versions of the self, one of which is no longer inhabiting you, and the slow, strange recognition that the one looking is not the one that used to look. What died was not your capacity, it was your willingness to disappear inside another person's idea of who you should be. That willingness had a long life. It learned to call itself love. It learned to call itself sensitivity. In some periods, it called itself virtue, the nobility of the one who absorbs, who adjusts, who softens the hard edges of their own soul to make room for whatever the room requires. And in the deepest places, it called itself necessity, because to be readable, recognizable, to be the self that others could locate and use and return to felt for a very long time, like the condition of existing at all. The ego that forms under pressure forms toward legibility. I observed this again and again in my work, not as a theory about patience, but as a fact about how psychic survival operates when the environment is too demanding or too uncertain. The child, who cannot afford to be opaque, becomes transparent, not because transparency is chosen, but because it is the only form that does not provoke danger. And that transparency becomes structure, it becomes character, it becomes what you call yourself for decades before you understand that it was a strategy, not a soul. The soul has always been less readable than that, more dense, more dangerous to approach directly. The soul does not bend toward legibility, it bends toward wholeness, which is an entirely different direction, and which, at a certain depth, requires the dissolution of the identity that was built on being understood. This is the death I am pointing to, not metaphorical death, not the small deaths of disappointment or loss, though those are real and they matter, the death of the self that survived by being visible, the death of the self that kept itself in a form that others could recognize and therefore could love, or use, or depend upon. When that self dies and it does not announce its dying, it simply one day is no longer available. What remains does not feel like more. It feels, at first, like less, like a kind of silence where the noise used to be, like a surface that has gone still without your choosing. In my work on the individuation process, I observed that the most significant psychic deaths are almost never experienced as liberation while they are occurring. They are experienced as loss, as a strange subtraction, as a puzzling discovery that something you thought was you has stopped responding. You reach for the familiar reaction, the familiar guilt, the familiar surge of accommodation, and it is not there. Not suppressed, not delayed, simply not there, and in the place of its absence is something that does not yet have a name, something you are not yet certain is trustworthy, something that feels, in its unfamiliarity, slightly cold. That coldness is not pathology, that coldness is the first atmosphere of a self that has stopped performing its own survival. I want to stay with this for a moment, because it is easy to mistake. The people around you will not mistake it slowly, they will mistake it quickly and completely and with great certainty. They will call it distance, they will call it coldness, they will call it a loss of empathy, a hardening, a closing, a turning away from the relational life that once defined you, and some part of you, the part that still carries the memory of the transparent self, will hear their description and wonder whether they are right, whether the absence of the old accommodation is not wholeness but damage, whether the self that no longer rushes to be readable is not integrated but injured. It is not, but I do not expect you to simply take that on my word. What I ask instead is that you notice something more precise. Notice whether the stillness inside you feels like indifference, a flat, featureless absence of care, or whether it feels like a surface that holds without being disturbed. Indifference is a defense, stillness is a structure, indifference empties. Stillness contains, and what you are carrying now, in this place beyond the return, is not empty. You know it is not empty. It is denser than what was there before. It is slower. It is less willing to be moved by forces that do not originate inside itself. The shed skin is still visible. Sometimes you pass it in memory, a conversation you would have had differently, a version of yourself in a room you no longer enter, a way of explaining yourself to someone who needed you small, and there is, I will not pretend otherwise, a quality of mourning in that, not for the situation, for the effort, for the enormous, sustained, mostly invisible effort of being a self that could be found by others at the precise coordinates they needed you to occupy. That effort was not nothing. It shaped you. It gave you a fine-grained sensitivity to the internal weather of other people, a precision of perception that, in the healed form, becomes genuine discernment rather than anxious scanning. But the effort itself, the ongoing labor of transparency that is finished, something inside you understood, that it could not continue, not as a decision. Decisions can be reversed. As a fact, there is a particular moment, and you will know it when I name it. When someone who has always been able to reach you discovers they cannot, they do not discover this gently. They try the door that has always opened. It does not open. They try it again, with more pressure, with a different angle, with a particular tone that used to work, the one that carried just enough need inside it to activate the old mechanism in you, the one that turned your boundaries into apologies. That tone reaches you now, and something registers it, categorizes it, and does not move. They try another door. That one is closed also. What follows is not always anger, though anger comes. What follows first is a kind of bewildered searching, a recalibration, because the person who is reaching for you built their map of you during a period when you were organized around accessibility, when your interior was, if not always visible, at least consistently available for approach, and the map they are holding, the map that shows where to press, where to appeal, where to make you feel responsible for their comfort, that map is describing a territory that no longer exists. I have seen this in my clinical work, and I have seen it in a form even more instructive than the clinical. I have seen it in the way certain people respond to transformation in someone they believed they understood. The response is not neutral. It is not merely confused. It carries, almost always, a quality of accusation, as though the transformation were a betrayal, as though you owe the people who built their lives around your accessibility the courtesy of remaining accessible, as though becoming whole were a form of abandonment. And here is where the psychological weight becomes heaviest, because you were trained not by malice, usually, but by long repetition to experience the discomfort of others as your responsibility. The person in distress, the person who cannot find you, the person whose old map no longer functions, their discomfort lands on you not as information but as demand. And the demand carries the grammar of guilt. You have done something, you have taken something away, you have closed what should remain open. The guilt is not imaginary. I want to be precise about this. The guilt is real. It is produced by a very old, very established neural and psychic pattern that learned early and reliably that the distress of others signals danger to the self, not metaphorical danger, real danger, the kind that at the developmental origin of this pattern meant loss of connection, loss of safety, possibly loss of everything that made existence bearable. The guilt you feel when someone cannot reach you is not weakness. It is the residue of a survival structure that was, in its original context, entirely rational. But you are not in that context anymore. The survival structure is running in a present that did not produce it, and when a survival structure runs in a context that no longer requires it, it does not simply deactivate, it performs, it generates the emotion without the necessity, it creates the sensation of danger where there is only disappointment, and the task of individuation, the specific, unglamorous, daily task is not to eliminate the guilt, but to learn to hold it without acting from it, to let it pass through the body the way weather passes through a landscape, to notice it, name it, and decline to be governed by it. This is harder than it sounds. It is harder, I think, than most accounts of healing are willing to admit, because the guilt does not arrive alone. It arrives with company. It arrives with memory, the specific memory of the version of yourself that would have responded, that would have opened the door, that would have reorganized itself to provide whatever was needed. And alongside the memory comes something even more difficult, the recognition that the old self was not entirely without value, that the transparency, the accessibility, the willingness to be found, these things produced genuine moments of connection, real intimacy, real usefulness. The person who could always be reached was not a fiction, and the grief of leaving that person behind is not simple. It contains gratitude. Alongside the release, it contains the acknowledgement that you paid a very high price for something that was nonetheless real. I once wrote in Essence that we do not become whole by eliminating what we were, but by understanding what it cost us. The ash carries this, not the fire, the ash. The fire is the event, the burning, the transformation, no one scheduled, but the ash is what remains after neither the original material nor the flame, but the residue that holds very precisely the shape of what was consumed. You cannot look at ash and pretend the burning did not happen. You cannot look at ash and pretend the original form was not real. What you can do, what you are doing, is notice that the ash is not the fire, and the fire is not you. And what remains after both is something that does not need to be either. The roles began to collapse in a particular order. This is worth attending to, because the order reveals something about the structure of the old self. The first role to collapse was usually the one most consciously maintained, the role of emotional anchor, of reliable presence, of the one who could be counted upon to remain stable while others moved through instability. This role had a kind of dignity to it. It felt chosen. It felt, in many moments, genuinely generous, and it was, in some proportion, genuinely generous. But underneath the generosity was something else, the unconscious understanding that stability was the price of admission, that to be unstable, to have needs, to be unreachable, to move away from the position of anchor, was to risk the loss of the relationships that had been built around your reliability. When the healing happened, and I use the word carefully, not to mean resolution, but to mean the integration of the split-off material, the return of the anger and the grief and the self-regard that had been suppressed in the service of accommodation. When that happened, the role could not hold, not because you decided to abandon it, because the interior material that had been suppressed in order to maintain it was no longer suppressed, and a role built on suppression cannot survive the return of what it suppressed. The second role to collapse was more intimate. This was the role of interpreter, the one who translated between people, who understood everyone's position well enough to soften the friction between them, who could hold multiple competing emotional realities simultaneously without losing themselves. This role was built on genuine perception, the sensitivity that had developed through years of reading other people's internal weather was real. But it had been organized unconsciously around a center that was not you. It had been organized around the need to maintain harmony in the relational field, and when the center shifted, when the self that had oriented itself outward began, slowly and irreversibly, to orient itself inward, the interpretive function lost its organizing principle. You could still perceive, you still perceived with the same precision, perhaps with more, but the perception was no longer automatically placed in service of others' comfort, and a perception that is no longer automatically serving is perceived by those who depended on it as a withdrawal, as a refusal, as something withheld. This is where the social mislabeling occurs with the greatest intensity, because what looks from the outside like withholding is not withholding, it is priority, the same capacity, directed now by a different organizing intelligence, one that asks, before moving, whether this movement serves the whole self or only the relational field. That pause, that brief internal consultation is invisible to people who have learned to receive your perception as automatic, and what is invisible is easily misread as absence. You do not owe them the explanation. I do not say this as encouragement. I say it as a structural observation. The explanation would require you to become readable again in the very moment when the refusal of readability is precisely what you are integrating to explain yourself fully, to account for the change, to soothe the bewilderment of those whose map no longer functions, would be to step back into the transparent self at exactly the threshold of leaving it. And the psyche does not do this neutrally. It knows what you are being asked to sacrifice, and it knows, at a level below conscious articulation, that the sacrifice is not neutral this time, that this time the return would cost more than the going. 1034 a.m. There is a dream I want to bring to you now, not yours, precisely, and yet perhaps yours. The dreamer is in a room. The room is familiar in the way. Rooms in dreams are familiar not because you have been there before in waking life, but because the room knows you. The walls carry something, writing, perhaps, or a pattern that resembles writing, and when you move toward it to read what is there, you find your own name. Oh, what was your name? Because as you stand before it, the letters do not resolve into anything legible. You know the way you know things in dreams, without the mediation of logic that this is your name, and you cannot read it. You stand there for a long time, not in distress, exactly in something closer to attention. The name is there, you are there, and between you and the name is a distance that was not present before, a distance that has the quality not of separation, but of completion, as though the name belonged to a version of the self that has finished its work and left the room without you noticing, and what you are, standing before it, is the one who came after. I have encountered this dream in various forms, with remarkable consistency in people undergoing the deeper passages of individuation. The specific content shifts sometimes. It is a name, sometimes a face, sometimes a house that no longer contains any furniture the dreamer recognizes, but the structure is identical. The confrontation with an image of the former self that can no longer be inhabited, and the strange, uncanny quality of that confrontation, not grief, exactly, not relief, exactly, something more precise than either, the recognition that what you are looking at is real and finished and no longer requires you to carry it. The psyche produces this dream at a very specific moment, not at the beginning of transformation. The beginning is too turbulent, too full of the noise of the old structure defending itself, and not at the end. If there is an end, the psyche produces it at the threshold, at the moment when the former self has completed its dissolution, but the new organization has not yet become fully habitable, when you are, in a very real sense, between selves, not lost, between. In my work on the symbolic life, I observed that this between state is the most psychologically dangerous, not because it is the most painful. Pain has its own navigational logic, but because it is the most ambiguous. Pain tells you something is wrong and requires response. The between state tells you nothing. It simply holds you in a suspension that feels, from the inside, remarkably like stillness and remarkably like emptiness, and requires a discernment. Most people have not been given the tools to perform the discernment between a stillness that is arriving and a stillness that is only the absence of what used to be there. The still water appears again here, because still water looks the same whether it is arriving or whether it is merely what remains after the current has stopped. The surface gives no indication, and this is exactly the terror, if terror is not too dramatic a word. And I do not think this is exactly the terror of the between state, that you cannot, from inside it, know with certainty which kind of stillness you are inhabiting, whether what has gone quiet in you is the exhaustion of a completed death or the first atmosphere of something that has not yet become visible enough to name. What I can tell you, not as reassurance but as observation, is that the between state has a particular texture that distinguishes it from simple depletion. Depletion is flat, it has no interior dimension, it does not notice itself. The between state, by contrast, is remarkably self-aware, not in the anxious, self-monitoring way of someone who is performing their own recovery, but in the quiet way of a landscape that knows the season has changed even before any single tree has fully turned. There is a knowing in it, a knowing that something has completed, even if the completed thing cannot yet be fully articulated. And that knowing is not nothing, it is, in fact, the first evidence of the new organizing intelligence beginning to operate. The anger is part of this. I want to speak about the anger carefully, because it is the most misunderstood element of what happens in this passage, and because it is also the most essential. The anger did not arrive during the healing. The anger was always there. What happened during the healing was not the creation of anger, but the return of anger that had been split off, held outside the self's conscious ownership. Because anger, For the self that survived through legibility was the most dangerous emotion available. More dangerous than grief, more dangerous than fear, because grief can be made sympathetic, fear can be made small, but anger, genuine anger, the anger that carries within it the full claim of the self on its own right to exist and refuse and require, that anger could not be made sympathetic. It could not be made small, and so it was exiled. Exiled anger does not disappear. This is one of the most clinically reliable observations I made across decades of work with the unconscious. Exiled anger becomes the infrastructure of the shadow. It does not dissolve into harmlessness, it organizes, it takes on density and direction, and the longer it remains exiled, the more it develops a life that is, strictly speaking, autonomous, running outside the self's conscious control, appearing in dreams, in physical symptoms, in the inexplicable depressions that descend without apparent cause, in the moments of disproportionate response to small provocations that leave the person bewildered by their own intensity. You know some version of this? The flash of feeling that arrived too large for its occasion, the dream in which you said something to someone, something final and unretractable, and woke not with guilt but with the strange, disorienting recognition that what you said in the dream was true, that the dreaming self had access to a claim the waking self had been carefully, methodically preventing from being spoken. The integration of that anger is not, as it is sometimes characterized, a release. Release implies that what was held under pressure now escapes into open air and dissipates. What actually happens is denser and more permanent than that. The anger does not dissipate, it is metabolized, it is taken back into the self and converted not into gentleness, not into forgiveness, though those may come later and separately, but into structure, into the interior architecture that makes it possible to refuse without explaining, to hold a boundary not as a decision that can be revisited under sufficient pressure, but as a fact of the self's organization, as something that is simply true about who you are now, the way the shape of a bone is true about the body, not chosen moment to moment, not maintained by effort, but present because it is what the structure has become. This is what I mean when I speak of boundaries as structure rather than as strategy. A strategy can be argued with. A strategy has a rationale that can be challenged, undermined, worn down over time by someone who is sufficiently persistent or sufficiently skilled at finding the precise angle of approach that makes the rationale seem inadequate. A structure cannot be argued within the same way, not because it is defended. Defense implies something that could be breached, but because it is simply what is there. The wall is not defending the room. The wall is the room. And this distinction between a self that holds its limits through ongoing effort and a self whose limits are now part of its constitution is the distinction that the people around you sense without being able to name. What they sense is not distance, it is not coldness, though they call it that. What they sense is the end of negotiability, and the end of negotiability, for people who have built their access to you on the assumption that sufficient pressure or sufficient need would always eventually open a path, feels like the loss of something they believed was theirs. It was never theirs, but I do not ask you to say that. I ask you only to know it. The ash holds the specific temperature of what burned. This is not a poetic observation, it is a structural one. The residue of a completed transformation carries within it the precise record of what was consumed and how completely, and what you are carrying now in the constitution of this new self is not an absence, it is a record, the full weight of what was survived, what was suppressed, what was slowly, over years and decades, metabolized into the self that stands here now, unable to return, unwilling to perform the old legibility, and carrying in its very density the evidence of everything that could not be carried any other way. The second dream arrives now. You are in a field, or a space that has the quality of a field open, uncontained by walls, and somewhere in the field there is a fire, not a destructive fire. The fire is burning, but nothing around it is being consumed. The grass is not burning, the air is not burning, the fire burns in a kind of self-contained integrity, generating light and heat without requiring anything outside itself to sustain it. And you are watching it from a distance that feels exactly right, not too close to be endangered, not too far to feel the warmth and what you feel. Watching it is not wonder, not fear, not even comfort. What you feel is recognition. The fire is not a symbol of destruction in this dream. It is a symbol of sufficiency, of a self that burns on its own fuel, that does not require the presence of external material to remain lit. And the recognition you feel standing before it is the recognition of something you have been approaching for a long time without knowing you were approaching it. A mode of existing that does not require constant supply from outside, that does not need the confirmation of others to know it is real, that burns steadily in the open field of a life that has stopped organizing itself around the question of whether it will be understood. The people who needed you legible will not all leave at once. Some will stay and adjust, not because they understood what happened, they did not, and most of them never will, but because something in their own psyche recognized below the level of conscious articulation that the self they had access to before was also not entirely real, that the relationship built on your transparency was built on a foundation that could not hold indefinitely, and in the wreckage of that recognition, painful, disorienting, without ceremony, a different kind of contact becomes possible. Not the contact of access, not the contact of being found at the coordinates others needed you to occupy, the contact of two people standing in the same space without either of them requiring the other to be smaller. This contact is rarer than it should be, and it asks more of both people than the old arrangement asked of either. But it is the only contact that does not cost you the self you have just, at enormous expense, become. The others, the ones who cannot adjust, the ones whose entire relational grammar was organized around your accessibility. They will interpret your transformation in the only language available to them. They will say you have become cold. They will say you have become selfish. Some will say you have been changed by someone, influenced, pulled away by a force they cannot see and therefore cannot compete with. Some will wait with a patience that has the texture of certainty for you to return to the form they recognize. They will wait because they have waited before in other seasons of your withdrawal, and you have always returned, adjusted, reopened, explained yourself until the explanation rebuilt the bridge they needed. You will not return this time, not because you have decided not to, because the self that returned is not available, because what completed inside you completed in the direction of irreversibility, and irreversibility, true irreversibility, the kind that is not a position but a fact of the psyche's new organization, is not something that can be undone by sufficient waiting, or sufficient guilt, or the particular quality of need that used to move you most reliably. I want to be precise about irreversibility because it is easily mistaken for rigidity, and the mistake matters. Rigidity is a defense. It is the hardening of a boundary that is not yet structural, a border maintained by will against the pressure of the interior that wants to collapse it. Rigidity requires effort. It produces a particular kind of exhaustion, a tiredness that lives just below the surface of the refusal, and which the person who is being refused can often sense, can sense the effort behind the wall, and therefore knows correctly that the wall is not the self, only the self's current decision about the self. What you are carrying now is not that. What you are carrying is closer to the simply factual. The door is not locked. The door has been absorbed into the wall. There is no mechanism to operate because the mechanism itself has been metabolized into the structure it once guarded. And this is what the people who knew you before are encountering when they try the old approaches and find nothing to push against, not resistance, not even refusal, simply a surface that has no opening because the opening is no longer part of the architecture. In my work on the relations between the ego and the unconscious, I observed that the most complete transformations are precisely the ones that produce this quality, not of someone who has decided to be different, but of someone who simply is different. In the way, a river that has found a new channel is different from the river that ran the old one. The water is the same water, the direction is entirely changed, and the old channel, over time, fills with silt and becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding land. And no one standing on it would know a river once ran there unless they knew to look. You are the river that found the new channel. The shed skin is still visible, occasionally, less often now. You pass it in the way you pass any artifact of a completed life, with a recognition that carries neither longing nor contempt, but something quieter and more final. The acknowledgement that it was real, that it served, that it cost what it cost, and that it is finished. The skin held the shape of the self that survived through legibility, the self that bent its interior toward the exterior requirement, the self that learned, early and completely, to experience its own existence as conditional on its readability to others. That self was not a failure. It was a strategy that worked precisely well enough to bring you to the threshold where a different self could emerge. But the strategy is no longer running. The self that needed it is no longer present, and what remains is not a better version of that self. It is a different organization, entirely one whose relationship to others is no longer structured around the question of whether it will be understood, but around the simpler and more demanding question of whether the contact is real. Real contact is not comfortable. I want to say this without softening it. The self that has completed this passage does not become easier to be in relationship with in the ways that are usually valued: the warmth of automatic availability, the reassurance of consistent accessibility, the comfort of a presence that adjusts itself to the needs of the room. Those qualities are diminished or gone. What replaces them is something that many people will not know: how to receive a presence that is fully itself, that does not perform its care, that does not translate its interior into a form optimized for the other's comprehension. A presence that requires, for genuine contact, that the other person also be willing to be fully themselves. Most people are not ready for this, not because they lack the capacity, but because they have not been asked for it before. The relationship built on your accessibility did not ask them to be fully themselves. It asked them only to be present enough to receive what you were offering. And the transition from that to something mutual, something that requires full presence from both sides, is a transition many will not make, not out of malice, out of the genuine difficulty of being required to occupy your own interiority when you have learned, in the presence of a certain person, to let their interiority carry the weight. The still water holds this without disturbance, not because it is indifferent to what passes over its surface, but because its depth is no longer organized around the surface. What happens above the weather, the reflection, the passage of light and shadow across the day, all of it registers, all of it is real, and none of it disturbs the temperature of what lies below. And the temperature of what lies below is the temperature of the self that has completed its long education in survival and arrived without ceremony, without announcement, at the simple and irreducible fact of its own existence. This is what resurrection means. Psychologically, not the return of what was lost, not the restoration of what was broken, the arrival of what was always there but could not be inhabited until everything that was built over it, the strategies, the roles, the beautiful, costly architecture of legibility had finished burning. The ash is still warm. It will be warm for some time. You will find it in unexpected places, a familiar tone of voice, a particular quality of need directed at you from someone you love. A moment in which the old mechanism stirs and you feel, briefly, the gravitational pull of the person you used to be. This is not failure. This is the cooling. The ash cools slowly, and the cooling is part of the completion, not evidence that the completion has not occurred. What has completed inside you is not a project you undertook. It is not a healing you pursued. It is not the result of sufficient understanding or sufficient will or sufficient time. What has completed, that self has used up every form available to it. It has bent toward legibility until bending was no longer possible. It has survived every survival it was capable of surviving, and in the final survival, the survival of its own dissolution, it produced without intending to, the only self that was never available before, the one that does not need to return,